Now,
Thank you very much, Madam Goudreau.
Mr. Barrett.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. We find ourselves back here again, 33 hours in, and hear a recounting from the Liberals of their previous testimony. And so early in the meeting, Mr. Angus laid out what brought us here, and we've heard from Madame Gaudreau the plain reason why this ought to come to a vote. Everyone has had their say. I'd like to speak briefly to and address the comments made by Mr. Dong. And he made comments with respect to the Speaker Spotlight documents. Now, he read into the record a tweet from that organization, and the comments that I made in committee was the information that was provided to us, and the situation where some of the information is still there, some of it has been purged. There was no there's no lies that have been spoken by me, and I find it really interesting to hear Mr. Dong, talk about the offense of having Ms. Gladue come to committee and address the motion that was ruled out of order. For Mr. Dong to interject and on points of order and say they weren't points of order, when one of the Liberal substitutes who came to the committee, Mr. Drouin, interjected a few times and attempted to take control of the meeting in a pretty high-pitched way. And it's interesting because the connections to the Ontario Liberal Party that the federal Liberals have are pertinent to the question of destroyed documents. And the Chief of Staff to former Ontario Liberal Premier Dalton McGuinty, David Livingston, was found guilty and ultimately sent to jail for mischief in relating to data and attempted misuse of a computer system to commit mischief. And in the ruling, it stated, quote, Mr. Livingston's plan to eliminate sensitive and confidential work-related data, in my view.
Order, Chair.
Mr. Cervera.
Chair, as you've commented several times today on relevance, I have no idea what Mr. Barrett's train of thought and commentary is in terms of relevant to the motion and the information at hand in the conversation we're having as a committee.
Okay, Mr. Cervera. Mr. Barrett, I believe that you were speaking about Mr. Dong's comments in regard to a tweet that you had in this committee. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, continue on and just make sure that the members know your relevance.
Yep, thank you, Chair. Interesting to hear that comment from Mr. Sorbera, who decided to offend the sensibilities of Canadians at this committee by spending time talking about his preference and what kind of underwear he would wear instead of addressing the motion at hand.
Point of order, Chair. That's completely unnecessary banter and talk, and it's actually quite offensive that Mr. Barrett would go down that on a personal basis. We were speaking about a company called Stanfields in Canada, had nothing to do with undergarments. Not sure where the CPC is going with this on this committee and this diatribe that they're having, but it's quite obvious that they're not concerned about the well-being of Canadians and where the direction of this committee is going. So MP Barrett, please, we can do better than that. Raise the bar on your conversation, please.
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Angus.
I would ask you to ask Mr. Sorbera to read the rules of order, because I feel now he's actually trying to deliberately interfere and be provocative. We need to get on with this. Mr. Sorbera will have all afternoon to talk about Stanfield's underwear if he wants, as long as it pertains to the motion. But we need to get back to the issue at hand so we can try and get to a vote today.
Please continue on, Mr. Barrett.
Right. And so, as I said, Chair, it was Mr. Sorbera's words when he decided to discuss his preference and the type of underwear he would wear when he spoke to this committee. So when we talk about offensive, these are choices that Mr. Sorbera made. So to continue where I left off with respect to the relation between the Ontario Liberal Party and the federal Liberals, and the Chief of Staff to former Liberal Premier Dalton McGuinty, David Livingston, who was found guilty and ultimately—
Point of order.
Yes, Mr. Dong.
Point of order, Chair. I understand you said you asked Mr. Barrett to show the relevance of—
You haven't let me finish my sentence.
His debate with— no, I just got interrupted by him again on a point of order. And now he's talking about a provincial party, which has, I even as a Liberal, I have no responsibility to comment or defend or say anything about a provincial Liberal party. And he's using it as an example. I just question the relevance of that.
Yeah, I understand, Mr. Dong, and I think I've been allowing everybody quite a number of minutes to steer back to relevance. So I'll give Mr. Barrett the same privilege to show us the relevance and come back to his point.
Right, and thanks, Chair, and Mr. Dong, who was serving as a member of the Ontario Liberal Party when the Chief of Staff to former Liberal Premier Dalton McGuinty, David Livingston, was found guilty and sent to jail. I'm going to finish my sentence, guys. You can keep interrupting me.
No, point of order, Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Dong.
What Mr. Barrett said is completely untrue. I served between 2014 to 2018. And I wasn't there when he's talking about when he's mentioned about provincial Liberal individual, and I don't think it has any relevance to the motion that we're debating. I just want to correct the record on that.
Okay, colleagues, just to remind everybody that points of order are for procedure, and you'll always have a chance to correct the record when your speaking slot comes up, and I'm certain that everybody will take that full freedom to do that. So. Please continue on, Mr. Barrett.
Right, and Chair, the criminal case which saw the former Chief of Staff to Ontario Liberal Premier Dalton McGuinty, Mr. David Livingston, convicted and found guilty of those charges certainly did take place when Mr. Dong was serving in the provincial legislature. And the ruling stated that Mr. Livingston's plan to eliminate sensitive and confidential work-related data, in my view, amounted to a scorched earth strategy where information that could be potentially useful to adversaries, both within and outside of the Liberal Party, would be destroyed, closed quote. And so we've just seen the energy and effort that will go to the Liberal members trying to prevent substantive points being put on the record with respect to the record of Liberal parties. And we had Mr. Drouin who had those excited interventions. Worked for that premier, and here we are trying to get the truth. Here we are trying to get to a vote, and the Liberal members on the committee objected to the ruling of the chair, and they lost the chair challenge. And now it seems that even though they got their say, because they didn't get their way, they're not willing to let this come to a vote. And the sensibilities of Canadians are rightly offended by the 33 plus hour filibuster that we have here. And we heard from Mr. Dong a list of expenditures. Now, expenditures shouldn't be the sole measure of success. We need to see results as well. But I can tell you that the resources expended on 33 hours of filibustering could be much better spent. And the folks in my community who are looking for all kinds of help don't see a government that's serious about transparency. And we heard a very long speech about transparency from Mr. Dong while engaged in a cover-up filibuster. And so the points have been made many times over, and it is certainly high time for it to come to a vote. And this is how democracy works. And if the Liberals have made convincing arguments to a sufficient number of their colleagues on both sides of the aisle, then they will carry the day and they will be able to defeat the motion. But if not, the motion will go forward, and we will take a look at the CSSG and the awarding of the contract to Baylis Medical and Palantir. And we're gonna have someone from Speaker Spotlight come to talk about these documents, and they can fully explain their process and clarify what has been unclear, and provide the information that the committee has been looking for. And then we can move on. But we've heard from many Liberals, permanent members of the committee and otherwise, and they were loath to hear the connections between the provincial Liberals and their team. But they exist. We've seen that it's important that if documents aren't provided, if documents aren't tabled on the record, that there is a risk that they can be destroyed. And so time is of the essence for this committee to get documents. Time is of the essence for this committee to hear testimony, be it with the ventilators or with Mr. McNaughton, or with relation to the CSSG. This was a $500 million contribution agreement for the CSSG, originally billed as $912 million, to the benefit of $40+ million to the Kielburgers, who drew the connection themselves between members of the Trudeau family and their organization in their submission to cabinet. They're the ones who put pictures of the Prime Minister's family in their proposal to the federal cabinet. That's not something that the opposition did. That wasn't, us looking to create a witch hunt. That was that organization. That was their conscious choice in an effort to benefit from a lucrative agreement at the height of a pandemic, when they needed that contract quite badly, as they were laying off many employees. Chair, this committee has heard the arguments from all sides. It is certainly high time for us to have a vote. And as a final note, I would say to my colleagues, if they don't like hearing back what they've already talked about in committee, if they find it offensive later when repeated to them, and I'm happy to read the blues into the record again for Mr. Sorbera if he'd like. But they should be mindful of how they spend their hours, with
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Fergus.
Indeed, Mr. Chair, Mr. Barrett has opened the door for me to clarify the record on exactly reading the blues of what was said at committee. Because I took a look at this, I wasn't at that part of the committee when this exchange took place, and I decided to look this up. And here it is.
Point of order.
And here it is, sir. Mr. Sorbera had said, the last example I want to turn our attention to is that of the great iconic Canadian company called Stanfields, which manufactures numerous clothing articles. The company can trace its origins back to Nova Scotia in the 1850s. Former company chairman and CEO, and then he's interrupted, just like what had just happened, Mr. Chair, by Mr. Angus, who said, I don't remember that anybody has had any interest in underwear as part of this pandemic study. If the Liberals are going to continue to drag us down the hole of filibustering, the issue that they agreed to is with regard to Mr. Baylis, because he's a former member of Parliament, which makes it pertinent. If they're going to start to now talk about underwear, Mr. Chair, they are certainly wasting our time and taxpayers' time. So, Mr. Chair, as you could see, it was Mr. Angus who made that connection and not Mr. Sorbera. Thank you, sir.
Angus, you got a point? You have a point of order, Mr. Angus?
Well, Mr. Chair, I just think that watching Mr. Fergus go to bat for Stanfield's underwear from the 1850s on a point of order on what Mr. Sorbera had said about Stanfield's underwear shows that this committee is turning into farce. And I think it's not a point of order. It's just more obstruction. And so if Mr. Barrett has anything else to say, or if he can finish it, and we can continue on. But I just think Mr. Fergus's last interjection pretty much sums up what we've been subjected to and what the Canadian people have been subjected to for the last 33 hours. Point
of order, Mr. Chair, and this is exactly the reason why we need to make sure that we are all have interests in this.
Point of order, Chair, on this point of order.
And there's too much of a
point of order on this point of order, Chair.
At least allow me to
point of order on this point of order, Chair.
At least allow me to make the point of order so that you can figure out what your point of order is.
Colleagues, give me a second. Mr. Barrett, please, I've always let everyone extinguish their point of order first, even though I have to say, colleagues, as much as I respect and like working with you all, the vast majority are not procedural. The vast majority are comments, but I've allowed everybody that luxury. And so, Mr. Fergus, if you could make it brief, that would be great. And then I'll go down to Mr. Barrett.
I'll make it very brief. What's unfair, sir, is the sort of the attribution, sort of the drive-by smear that is put to another honorable member, when it's actually the person who raised it. Mr. Angus just did it perfectly again. He just decided to mock this situation when, in fact, he is the source of that statement. And that's what I'm trying to point out. And it's no more of a point of order than what you had raised, Mr. Angus or Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Sweet, please.
Colleagues, Mr. Barrett, you already have the floor. You don't need to arrest the floor with a point of order. So now they've been extinguished. You can go ahead.
Well, Chair, Mr. Fergus just said that, he, first of all, he didn't hear me. He was raising a point of order to the point of order on his point of order. So when I look to interject on that point, he has now said that, which I was not given the floor by you, Chair. He's now said that my point was invalid. So this is supreme arrogance. I want to read to you from the Blues, and I quote, November 3rd, 2020, 5:10 p.m., Francesco Sorbera, Vaughan Woodbridge, Ontario. Quote, I think that boxers are better than underwear, but that's a whole different story. Closed quote. Chair, this was the point that Mr. Fergus, you wanted to read the Blues into the record? There it is. So yes, he wanted to. We have liberal members who want to offer their
further above, Mr. Barrett.
Sorry, Chair. Could you have the member repeat his comment?
No, I think what we'll do, colleagues, it looks like the temperature's rising. Let's suspend for 10 minutes. Let's let the temperature go down. And Mr. Barrett, you'll have the floor when we return.